January 1st, 1945. While the world celebrated a new year, General George S. Patton faced a disaster that threatened to dismantle the moral authority of the United States Army. While General Eisenhower demanded a swift end to the Battle of the Bulge, a secret execution in the frozen Ardennes created a historical enigma. What did Patton discover in the snows of Chenogne? And why did he choose silence over justice? The answer lies buried in the archives. The Ardennes forest in midwinter was not merely a battlefield. It was a psychological furnace that forged a new, darker breed of soldier. By the turn of the year, the initial shock of the German Ardennes offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had transitioned into a grinding, visceral war of attrition. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, was under immense pressure from the Supreme Allied Commander and General Omar Bradley to collapse the German salient and relieve the battered 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. But as the American GIs pushed forward, they were fueled by a toxic mixture of exhaustion and a burning desire for vengeance. The atmosphere had been irrevocably poisoned weeks earlier at a crossroads near Malmedy. There, the 1st SS Panzer Division, under the command of Joachim Peiper, had executed over 80 American prisoners of war. Word of the massacre spread through the Allied lines like a contagion. In the mess tents and the foxholes, the standard rules of engagement began to dissolve. For the men of the 11th Armored Division, known as the Thunderbolts, the mission was no longer just about territorial gain. It was about balancing a ledger written in blood. Patton, in his private diaries, noted the rising hardness of his men, a transformation he viewed with a mixture of professional pride and silent concern. Tactical reports from the final days of December 1944 indicate that the German 3rd Panzergrenadier Division was digging into the small village of Chenogne, a cluster of stone houses that offered a formidable defensive anchor. Patton knew that every hour wasted in the Ardennes allowed the German Wehrmacht to fortify the Siegfried Line. He demanded aggression, he demanded results. However, the 11th Armored was a relatively green unit, seeing its first major action in one of the most brutal environments of the war. Their arrival on the front lines coincided with a directive that was never officially written but widely understood. The Waffen-SS were to be shown the same mercy they showed the men at Malmedy. On the morning of the assault, the temperature plummeted to levels that froze the oil in machine guns. A thick, suffocating fog rolled across the Belgian landscape, reducing visibility to a mere few yards. The tactical friction was immense. M4 Sherman tanks struggled for traction on the black ice of the narrow roads, their engines screaming in the sub-zero air. The infantry of the 21st Armored Infantry Battalion prepared to storm the village, their breath hitching in the frozen air. The struggle for Chenogne was not a cinematic clash of armies, but a house-to-house brawl involving submachine guns and grenades at point-blank range. By mid-morning, the German defense began to crumble under the relentless pressure of American artillery and direct tank fire. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the SS began to emerge from the smoldering ruins of the village, their hands raised in the universal sign of surrender. Under the laws of land warfare and the Geneva Convention, these men were now protected entities. They were disarmed, searched, and herded into an open field near a woodline on the outskirts of the village. According to declassified National Archive reports and later testimonies found in private memoirs, there were approximately 80 prisoners. The GIS guarding them were tired, frostbitten, and haunted by the stories of Malmedy. The command hierarchy at the local level faced its first moral crisis. The prisoners represented a logistical burden in the middle of an active offensive. They required guards, food, and transport to the rear, resources that were in short supply during the frantic counterpush. But more than logistics, there was the weight of the unspoken order. The soldiers positioned their machine guns. There was no heat of battle here. The fighting in that sector had largely ceased. What followed was a rhythmic, systematic discharge of small arms fire that lasted for several minutes. When the smoke cleared, the snow was no longer white. News of the shooting traveled fast up the chain of command, reaching the ears of Major General Edward H. Brooks, who then had the unenviable task of informing the higher echelon. When the report finally landed on the desk of General George S. Patton, it was a ticking time bomb. Patton was a man who lived by a strict code of martial honor, yet he was also a pragmatist who understood the optics of war. A formal investigation by the Inspector General would mean arresting combat officers and soldiers in the middle of the most critical offensive of the Western Front. Patton's personal diaries, which serve as a primary window into his psychological state during this period, reveal a man deeply conflicted but ultimately driven by the mission. He noted the unfortunate incident, but his concern was not for the lives lost. It was for the integrity of the Allied advance. He understood that Joseph Goebbels in the Nazi propaganda ministry would seize upon such a massacre to steal the resolve of the German people, portraying the Americans as hypocrites who ignored the very Geneva Convention they claimed to uphold. The tactical mystery of Chenogne lies in the deliberate erasure of the event from the official daily unit war diaries. While the Battle of the Bulge is one of the most documented events in human history, the specific after-action reports for the 11th Armored Division on that day underwent a refinement. Patton faced a leadership dilemma that would haunt the archives for decades. Do you sacrifice the truth to maintain the momentum of victory? Or do you risk the front line to uphold the law? Patton consulted with his trusted colleagues, including General Omar Bradley. The internal friction was palpable. Bradley was often the stabilizing force to Patton's volatility, yet even the soldiers general recognized the catastrophic implications of a war crimes trial involving American liberators. The decision was made to treat the incident as a localized failure of discipline rather than a systemic crime. The bodies were buried in mass graves, and the snow continued to fall, covering the evidence of the morning's work. The logistical reality of the Ardennes meant that moving thousands of men and vehicles required absolute focus. Patton's Third Army was a masterpiece of military engineering and movement, and he would not allow a Green Division's mistake to derail the liberation of Europe. He pushed his commanders harder. The orders became more insistent. The massacre at Chenogne became a ghost, spoken of only in whispers by the men who were there, and hidden behind the bravado of the Thunderbolt Division's official history. As the American forces pushed closer to the German border, the intensity of the war reached its zenith. The soldiers realized that the closer they got to the heart of the Reich, the more desperate and fanatical the resistance would become. The events at Chenogne had established a grim precedent. The no-quarter policy, while never sanctioned by Eisenhower or Marshall, became a functional reality on the ground. We must look at the primary sources, the private letters sent home by the men of the 21st Armored Infantry. In these letters, often bypassed by censors due to the sheer volume of mail, we see the cracks in the American heroic narrative. Soldiers wrote of the darkness they felt and the difficulty of returning to a world of laws after participating in a world of raw retribution. The psychological toll of the Ardennes was beginning to rival the physical casualties. Patton continued to project an image of invincibility. He visited the front lines, his ivory-handled revolvers a symbol of his old-world approach to command. But behind the bravado was a commander who knew he was sitting on a secret that could end his career if it ever reached the press in Washington. The tension between his public persona and his private knowledge created a leadership vacuum that would only be filled years after his death. The first act of this tragedy concludes with the Allied forces finally breaking the German grip on the Ardennes. The Bulge was being pushed back, but the cost was more than just lives. It was the loss of a certain moral clarity. As the 11th Armored Division moved toward its next objective, the village of Chenogne stood as a silent witness to a crime that the world was not yet ready to acknowledge. The transition from 1944 to 1945 marked the end of the crusade and the beginning of the execution. For the men of the Third Army, the war had become a mechanical process of destruction. General George S. Patton knew that the tactical pivot at Chenogne was just one of many dark decisions he would have to make before the Rhine was crossed. As the 11th Armored Division advanced beyond the Ardennes, the internal political pressure on Patton began to mount from the War Department. While the massacre remained a secret from the American public, the Army's internal investigators, including the Inspector General's office, were not so easily deterred. A preliminary inquiry began, led by officers who were removed from the visceral emotions of the front line. They looked at the casualty counts. They looked at the lack of German wounded processed in the Chenogne sector. The math of the battlefield did not add up. 80 soldiers do not die in a single field during a surrender without a catastrophic failure of command. Patton's reaction to the investigation was one of characteristic defiance and tactical redirection. In a heated meeting with his staff, he reportedly argued that the men who fought at Chenogne were heroes who had endured the unendurable. He viewed the legalists at headquarters as a threat to the operational success of the war. To Patton, the tactical pivot was not just about tanks, it was about the spirit of the American soldier. If that spirit was broken by a courtroom, the war might be lost. He famously told his aides that he would rather have a division that killed too many of the enemy than a division that was afraid to kill at all. Let us consider the perspective of the German survivors, those few who managed to escape into the woods before the firing began. Their accounts, later collected by historians and declassified in the 1970s, describe a scene of absolute horror. They spoke of American G as laughing, of the cold deliberation of the machine gunners, and of the realization that the liberators were capable of the same brutality as the SS. This perspective shift is crucial for understanding the full 360-degree reality of the Ardennes. It wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the soul of the men involved. The existential cost of the tactical pivot began to manifest in the high rates of battle fatigue within the 11th Armored. Men who had participated in the executions found it increasingly difficult to reintegrate into the normal rhythms of military life. The leadership secret that Patton held was a weight shared by hundreds of young Americans who would carry the silence of Chenogne back to their small towns in the Midwest and the factories of the North. The primary documents from the medical corps during this period show a spike in neuropsychiatric cases following the cleanup of the Belgian salient. Patton's rivalries with other generals, such as Bernard Montgomery and his own superior, Dwight D. Eisenhower, also played a role in his decision to bury the truth. Patton was already a controversial figure, having been sidelined after the slapping incidents in Sicily. He knew he was on his final chance. Any scandal, especially one involving a mass execution of prisoners, would give his rivals the ammunition they needed to remove him from command forever. He was fighting two wars, one against the Wehrmacht and one against his own reputation. The thematic core of this story is the shadow of the event. While the history books focus on the heroic relief of Bastogne, the shadow of Chenogne stretches across the entire campaign. It forces us to ask, does the evil of the enemy justify a descent into the same darkness? Patton's answer was a resounding yes, provided that victory was the result. He believed that the ends, the destruction of the Third Reich, justified the means, even if those means involved the systematic execution of surrendered men. At this height of tension, we must pause for a moment of alternate reality. Imagine if Patton had allowed the investigation to proceed in the winter of 1945. Imagine if dozens of American soldiers were court-martialed and executed for war crimes while the war was still raging. The immediate catastrophe would have been a collapse in Allied unity. The Soviets would have used the incident to justify their own atrocities in the East, and the American public's support for the good war might have faltered. Patton's cover-up, however ethically bankrupt, may have preserved the coalition that defeated Hitler. This is the existential burden of command. The tactical execution of the cover-up was as precise as any of Patton's armored thrusts. Reports were misfiled. Witnesses were transferred to different units. The village of Chenogne was essentially bypassed in later official histories of the Battle of the Bulge. It became a footnote, a regrettable incident mentioned in a few obscure memoirs. The National Archives reveal that even the official photographers were directed away from the execution site, ensuring no visual record of the crime could ever reach the newspapers. By March 1945, the Third Army was crossing the Rhine. The glory of the advance overshadowed the secrets of the past. Patton was at the height of his power, yet the ghost of Chenogne remained in his journals. He wrote of the hard necessity of war and the burden of command. He saw himself as a historical figure who had to do the dirty work so that civilization could survive. He was a man out of time, applying the brutal logic of ancient conquerors to a modern, industrialized conflict. The primary sources, the daily unit war diaries of the 21st Armored Infantry, eventually revealed the truth decades later when researchers began to compare them with the personal accounts of the veterans. The discrepancies were glaring. The historical enigma was finally being solved, but by then Patton was long dead, and the men who fired the guns were old men looking for peace. The declassification of the Brooks reports in the late 20th century provided the final pieces of the puzzle, confirming that the high command knew of the massacre within 48 hours. We must also look at the civilian perspective. The Belgian villagers who returned to Chenogne found their homes destroyed and their fields filled with the bodies of young men. They didn't see generals or strategy. They saw the raw, ugly reality of human vengeance. Their stories, documented by local historians, add a layer of human cost that is often missing from military documentaries. To the people of Chenogne, the Americans were liberators who brought both freedom and a terrifying, unpredictable violence. The leadership dilemma of George S. Patton remains a cornerstone of military ethics studies. He was a man who understood that war is not fought by saints, but by men pushed to their absolute limits. His decision to protect his men at the expense of the law is a testament to his loyalty and his ruthlessness. He prioritized the mission over morality, a choice that many commanders have faced but few have executed with such cold efficiency. As we reach the final act of this narrative, the curiosity loops begin to close. The tactical mystery was the erasure of the records. The leadership's secret was the deliberate protection of war criminals to ensure operational success. And the historical enigma is the question of whether a good war can ever truly be fought with clean hands. Patton believed the answer was no, and he lived his life according to that grim philosophy. The story of Chenogne is the story of the World War II that we don't like to talk about. It is the story of the cost of victory and the silence that follows. General Patton and his Thunderbolt Division achieved their objective. They broke the Bulge. They defeated the Reich, but they left a piece of their soul in the snow of a small Belgian village. History remembers the victory. The snow remembers the rest. In the heat of a total war against an enemy that has committed atrocities, can a commander ever be justified in covering up the crimes of his own men to ensure a faster victory? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.